Welcome, everyone, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us today. Thank you for joining us for our webcast. On behalf of Ethisphere, my name is Chelsea, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's presentation of the new Compliance Challenge, Protecting Confidential Assets from Cyber Threats and Malicious Insiders. There are a few logistical items I'd like to address before we begin today's session. We encourage you to engage in the question and answer portion of today's webcast by using the panel chat function you see located within the ReadyTalk experience. The presenters will reserve time during today's webcast to address as many questions as they can. However, if we do run out of time, they will follow up with you via email there afterwards and make sure they answer all questions you'd like to have answers to. Following the live webcast, we will follow up with an email providing you with access to the recording of today's session along with the PowerPoint materials. Also, if you're in need of a completion certificate, please send me an email. I'd be more than happy to get that over to you. We are very excited to be partnered with Create Today on today's webcast, and I'd like to introduce you to Pamela Passman, who is the President and CEO of the Center for Responsible Enterprise and Trade, as well as she will be joined by James Pooley. I'd like to now turn the floor over to Pamela to begin today's session. So Pamela, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Chelsea, and thanks so much to Ethisphere for hosting us today. I'm also quite pleased to have Jim Pooley join me. I think Jim is known by many of you. He has been a leading Silicon Valley lawyer for many decades and was from 2009 to 2014 the Deputy Director General for Innovation and Technology at the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO. Most recently, he's published the book Secrets, Managing Information Assets in the Age of Cyber Espionage, a really terrific practical book, and a lot of the insights from the book he will share with us today. So Jim, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Pamela. I'm glad to be here.
We have a number of issues that we want to cover on a topic that is in the headlines most weeks, if not days. And we've got an agenda on the slide. I do want to be sure that folks appreciate the context of this webinar is for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be and cannot be considered as providing legal advice or legal opinion. I also want to reinforce what Chelsea said. Please ask questions along the way. We will answer them along the way, and it'd be great to make this as interactive as we can. So I think we all appreciate how a company manages its information, whether it's customer data, customer financial or PII, or internal data or intellectual property, trade secrets, confidential information. All of it impacts a company's reputation and a company's business value. Many companies and supplier vendor codes of conduct include provisions regarding the handling and sharing of confidential and proprietary information. But as we've worked around the world, we see that very few companies actually implement this or follow this up with their employees or with their third parties. But as we've seen in the last few years, it's becoming more mainstream to think about how data and confidential information are managed and protected as a key aspect of corporate governance. With the threat of cyber risk growing and becoming almost inevitable, how a company manages cyber risk is critical. So we're going to focus today on the cyber landscape, the cyber threat landscape. We're going to talk about how you can embed management systems to secure assets and some leading practices. But what's really interesting in this new normal that we see, it's not a question of if, but when your company will face a cyber attack or breach or have its trade secrets or other confidential information compromised. And so it's not a surprise that in a recent PwC State of Compliance survey of compliance officials from companies around the world, the issue of data security jumped ahead as the #1 concern. And it's interesting because this issue was not included in prior surveys, and it actually is substantially higher concern than the others listed on the slide. And this is the issues that compliance function leaders prioritize in terms of the future perceived level of compliance-related risk over the next 5 years. So really looking out to 2020. So really the first two topics on the list relate to the issues that we'll talk about today. And they're not just concerns of client compliance leaders, they're concerns of general counsels, CEOs, and as I think we all appreciate, boards of directors.
Yeah, and Pamela, if I could jump in here, I just wanted to add the issue that we're dealing with, and it's interesting because of the sponsor of today's webinar. The framework, the legal framework for all this is grounded in ethics. That's where the law of secrecy developed in the U.S. by judges who, in individual cases, took actions that they felt were reinforcing the notion of morality in the commercial marketplace. So ethics actions that are that help protect your data also align with ethical issues in the operation. So it's an interesting aspect of how.
Great, thank you, Jim. I think we actually are fading in and out. So let me move on to the next slide. And this is just a segue into really, getting a sense of this aggressive threat environment in which companies are operating. And, why are we seeing so many breaches? So many breaches of personal identifiable information, personal health information, intellectual property, trade secrets, and other confidential information. And there clearly are a number of factors. I'll talk about 5 of them. And certainly, the globalized marketplace where one's employees, customers, suppliers, competitors are in many different countries with different legal regimes and cultural norms, fragmented value chains, just a level of complexity and fragmentation of suppliers, distribution, and value chains is quite significant. Most companies have a sense of the first tier of their supply chain, but very limited understanding beyond that. Relationships are based on contractual terms with little or any sense of the capacity of these business partners to actually protect or manage your confidential information. Most companies have a very
Go ahead.
Most companies have a very mobile workforce. Employees are spread around the world, and technical talent in particular are changing jobs in companies more frequently than a few years ago. And of course, employees using multiple devices to access corporate information. So a great deal of mobility, and of course, a very aggressive threat environment where there are bad actors, and we'll talk a little bit about them in a few minutes, are using a number of vehicles or vectors to infiltrate your network. And finally, so much information is digitized and accessible and able to move quite quickly. And again, the concept of just so much information being held by companies and the ability to move it is a great concern. Jim?
Yeah, I just want to reinforce that because the kind of information that we're talking about, notwithstanding the headlines that we see that are mostly about personal identification information, social security numbers, credit card numbers, and the like, much of what the bad guys are after these days, and certainly some of the most critical information losses, are about corporate data. The company's own data as well as data that is being held custodially for others under non-disclosure agreements. And so we need to be thinking about that kind of asset when we're talking about cyber risks.
Great, and just a little more in the context of the cyber threat landscape. There are a number of threat actors. I think you hear about and read in the newspaper probably more about nation states. But as Jim will highlight in a few minutes, it's really the insider, in particular the malicious insider, although there are also a lot of careless insiders. But it is the malicious insider that presents the greatest threat. They're often recruited by your competitors or, in some cases, nation states and organized crime. But all of these different threat actors are interested in and after your data and your corporate information for a variety of reasons. I think it is important to highlight organized crime. You don't really hear about it too much, but they're quite engaged. Where there is financial gain, there usually is organized crime. And then we do see examples of hacktivists for various social and political reasons attacking companies. We've listed a number of different methods of entry into your network. The issue of malware, very significant. And so understanding and protecting yourself, your company against malware, educating your employees about not opening up links unless they know exactly who has sent the information. All of these methods are being actively used by the bad guys. And seeking a variety of vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities, of course, around your people, your processes, and your technology. Jim, do you want to talk a little bit more about insider risk?
Yes, because the studies that have been done have shown that the vast majority of information that's lost is lost because of insiders. And of course, we focus on malicious insiders because they have an attitude that drives them to do what they do. But the line, in my experience, between actual malice and that sort of self-justification that people have when they feel a need for revenge or something like that is very thin. And in any event, most of the bad actors that you see listed here on this chart have to rely on the availability of insiders to get to the data that they need, somebody to open the door. And what that means is that our efforts to work with the workforce, to identify the people that may have leanings that will take them in that direction, and certainly to identify the soft spots for carelessness so that employees know what to do, what not to do, and when to report things. Those kinds of activities have the greatest amount of payoff when it comes to mitigating and reducing. So, Pamela, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And I also just want to highlight another idea of the insider is not just your current and former employees, but also your key third parties. And the bad guys typically look at where the weakest link is. And increasingly we see that are your third parties that for a variety of reasons may have access to your network. One of our participants has mentioned that the volume is too low, so hopefully we can increase that for you. I wanted to use the Sony example because it is, such a high-profile breach, a very bizarre breach for a number of reasons. But I continue to hear from companies that the Sony breach really was an inflection point for them. It just raised the awareness in their companies about the threats and the potential losses, and really for two reasons. First, the different kinds of information that was misappropriated or breached was so broad and so vast, it really was a wake-up call. It was not just, employee PII or financial data of the company, which was significant in itself. In fact, the financial data, Sony's own financial data was not only misappropriated, it was actually destroyed, so they no longer had access to it. But the vast array of IP and trade secrets, confidential information that was misappropriated was quite significant. And a lot of that came from employees' email and just access to different files through the network, including products and services, films and scripts that hadn't yet been released, business plans, discussions about talent, what different individuals were paid, different kinds of compensation schemes, a whole variety of things that the company had no intention of making public. And the second reason why it was an inflection point was that so many employees' information was compromised, so many employees' email was compromised, that it wasn't just the holders of PII or PHI, but a vast array of employees were impacted by this as well.
Yeah, let me take over at this point and talk a little bit about why the kind of information that we're dealing with here is the most important asset that we have to protect in the corporate sphere. There's been an absolute sea change in the way in which corporate assets are allocated, and we see this in the Brookings Institution study that reported in 1978 that 20% of the public company assets in the U.S. were represented by intangibles. By 1988, that had increased to 55%, to 1998, 70%, and these days most believe that it's well over 80%. And so in a single generation, we have seen an absolutely massive change in the nature of assets that are held by publicly held companies in the U.S. This has never happened before. And also very interestingly, in this recent report by the National Science Commission and the Census Bureau that looked at R&D intensive industries, that is the ones that account for 75% of R&D spending in the U.S., those industries, looking at the various ways in which they protect their competitive advantage provided by the information that they hold, protect it through secrecy more than twice as often as using patents. And so what this tells us is we have a massive amount of data consisting not just of technical information, but also financial data, unannounced products, customer data, marketing studies, strategic plans, all of which together represents the primary asset base of corporate America, and that is what has become at one time much more valuable and much more vulnerable.
And what we're seeing is that, despite the fact that this information is incredibly valuable, companies, with the low cost of keeping data, most companies are not focused on actually classifying and prioritizing what is most important or what's most valuable or sensitive. And thus they're not really putting their assets against securing what is really the highest value information. So most companies haven't taken the step to categorize, prioritize, and then think about, how do you allocate your resources to protect that which is most important, your crown jewels. So we want to turn now to discussing specifically about how to best manage your confidential assets, whether you call them confidential assets or information, trade secrets or so. What we see working with companies around the world, the importance of really embedding what we call business process or management systems in the protection of your confidential information across all of your business operations. And thinking about, as a company, what do you do well? Is it quality management? Is it health and safety? Is it anti-corruption? Is it intellectual property protection? What is it that you do well? How have you embedded the internal controls to do that process well? And to really learn from that. As we see, this very consistent deployment of internal controls across the company really helps build awareness throughout your employee base, throughout your third-party base, that this is an issue critical to the company. Again, you're communicating clear expectations, you're providing your employees and your third parties the tools they know to understand and to be able to effectuate this priority for the company. It is far more preventative and proactive. And again, it builds on management systems that you've used for other business operations. So clearly putting this management system in place requires a key group of individuals across an organization that have certain skills and experiences to bring to bear. What we increasingly see is that those in the compliance function, those in the legal function that have the experience related to various governance processes, addressing legal and reputational risk, are key players in building a cross-functional team to embed business process across an organization to better protect intellectual property and, in particular, trade secrets and confidential information. We've listed a number of people that we think are critical to be part of a cross-functional team, to be proactive in embedding the management systems across the company. And this also is the incident response team should there be a breach and a loss of information. We've also outlined some key stakeholders that should be engaged in advance so that if there is an issue, they are aware of how you need to respond. Outside counsel, forensics experts should also be included in that. But a key group of individuals who should be engaged with should there be a breach. Jim, do you want to add to that?
Yes. Doing it this way affects not only the quality of the systems that you put into place, because obviously having the perspectives of all of these different players is very important to getting a system that works best, that identifies all of the critical data, and that tags it with relative importance and where the judgments can be made best about what kind of resources should be applied. All of those things that go into normal risk management are always done better when you have a cross-functional team. So you will end up with a better plan. And it also, however, relates to responsibility and accountability for the actions that happen. When I have seen problems come up in this area, it has been largely because the functions have been truncated, fragmented. One person is left in charge but without sufficient direction and without sufficient support from colleagues. So if you are going to be doing this the right way that avoids problems down the road, you will involve everybody and pay attention to how accountability is enforced through this process. Now, the law that protects your information assets essentially requires that before the courts will ever get involved, you be able to show that you have exercised reasonable efforts. Now, 30, 40 years ago, all that meant was guarding the photocopier and watching who went in and out the front door. But now courts, before they will intervene on behalf of the company in some problem area where information has escaped and you need to stop it, before they will take action, they're going to look at what you have done to protect yourself. And this kind of effort is important not just for keeping your information safe, but proving to a court that you've done what you could have done yourself, so that if you need help and intervention from a court, you can get it. What courts require in terms of reasonable efforts is always going up because we have more and more tools available to us, and there's more information about good management techniques like this for protecting your assets. So as you go forward, you can assume that the courts are going to be expecting that your companies will be doing these kinds of programs in this way if they expect to be able to come to court to enforce their trade secret rights.
Thank you, Jim. And we have a few questions that I'd like to turn to. The first question is, where is internal audit on this team? A great question. We sort of, under the risk bullet, every company is organized differently, but enterprise risk management, internal audit, any of those teams that would be critical in assessing the breach and in advance, building the systems to better protect the information.
Yeah,
we have a second question.
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, we had another question about how priorities change. and how the effort has to respond to the changing importance of various aspects of the property. And that's a very good question and a very important point. These protection programs and the efforts that you put into information management are dynamic, and that's one of the reasons why you have to have a cross-functional team, so that information gets fed back quickly about when priorities have changed, when some of the assumptions that underlie the current plan have changed, so that the team can adjust what it is that the organization is doing.
Great. We're going to move on, and Jim, it would be very helpful if you could just spend a little bit of time talking about the role of board of directors. They're increasingly quite focused on, of course, the issue of cybersecurity. I think, like compliance officers, they rate it number 1 or number 2 in terms of the key issues impacting them. Why don't you talk a little bit about that? And if Chelsea or you could actually move the slide, since I'm not, for some reason, able to do that right now.
Okay, certainly. I mean, if we consider what we just talked about a few moments ago, that is how these information assets have become the company's most valuable property, representing the largest segment of accounting for the company's value in the marketplace. It's easy to see why boards should be paying attention to this. Of course, with all of the headlines and the stories that we've seen about attacks, that's another good reason, because there is concern over the security of these very important assets. And then the point that we just made about the cross-functional nature of any effort that the company makes effectively to protect these kinds of assets also implies that board leadership is very important here in order to set the kinds of top-level priorities for the company that are required to make this happen in the best possible way. All of this has to start at the top so that the message comes down to everybody that's involved. They must do this the right way, they must cooperate, and they have to report back to the board. Now, that implies, of course, that the board has to know very well what it's doing here. And this is a new task for many board members that haven't been used to dealing directly with information security. They've often assumed that this is just part of IT and it's a pure management function. But given the kinds of risks that have emerged, along with the growing value of the information that is at risk, these kinds of questions now all have to be addressed at the board level. And that implies the board needs to get training and education in cybersecurity and information asset management. It has to engage directly with oversight of management on these issues to ensure that information asset management is mainstreamed with the existing risk management and internal controls management that is going on inside the company. That typically is done with an information security or cybersecurity committee of the board, but there has to be good training, there has to be responsibility attached, and there has to be clear lines of communication between the specified managers, the managers who are specified to have this responsibility, and board members, so that if there is a problem or a need for direction, they can get it when it's necessary. It's simply a reflection of the drastically increased importance of this issue. If we are going to be able to operationalize things that, suggestions, if you will, that are not yet requirements, but guidance from government agencies like Commerce Department that has given us the NIST framework for protecting information security. If we're going to really operationalize those sorts of things, we need to have board leadership in order to make sure that it happens. And of course, as we'll probably get to when we continue this conversation, there are other reasons that have to do a little bit with the stick rather than the carrot. That is avoiding liability, avoiding shareholder litigation, complying with SEC guidance on information security, avoiding FTC issues. We'll get there. But the positive reason for board engagement is that the company needs, in moving to this new level of compliance on something that's relatively new, it needs that leadership.
Thank you, Jim. We have a question about what percentage of boards today have a dedicated cybersecurity committee. And from what I have seen, very few actually have a dedicated cybersecurity committee. There are a number of instances where the audit committee has taken this issue on. There's some boards that have what would be a regulatory affairs committee, and some of them have taken it on. I think there's a lot of discussion and debate at the full board level about whether this should be a topic that the full board reviews versus just a committee. There have been a lot of surveys done, in particular by some of the big consulting firms, that indicate that board members don't feel like they're getting enough information today and want to have more routine reports on cyber. They want to perhaps have someone on the board who has deeper information security experience as well.
Yeah, there's no single place where we can get answers about what is the right way to go, what are the perfect protocols at this stage, and so we have to look in the places that are currently available for hints about what government agencies, for example, expect from boards. And honestly, one of the places to look is under the Economic Espionage Act, which is the criminal statute that applies to trade secret theft. There is a fair amount of guidance provided by the federal sentencing guidelines that apply when prosecutors are deciding whether or not to prosecute a company or its officers for a trade secret theft, and also used by courts in deciding on sentencing. And in these guidelines, one of the things that is a very standout feature is a compliance plan. And it's interesting to see that in the compliance plan that the framers of these guidelines have prepared, they make it clear that they expect the board to be aware entirely and have a certain level of understanding about information security issues, although in this context it's about avoiding contamination by secrets that belong to others. But the same principle seems to apply. What I'm reading in looking across the various inputs from the government agencies that are weighing in on this, the FTC, the SEC, is that they expect some level of awareness by the entire board, but certainly I think it would actually be a positive sign that a committee is established to focus on these issues and to make sure that lines of communication are.
Great, thank you, Jim. We have another question. What would you suggest would be the key aspects of a company's cybersecurity setup that a board should understand at a minimum? A great question, a very complicated question. There's the whole issue of what a company has put in place to actually protect its assets. Equally important is what a company has in place to detect once there's been a breach or there's been a malicious contact inside of the company. I would refer you to the National Association of Corporate Directors, NACD, released a handbook for directors on how to manage cybersecurity in 2014. It's an excellent document. I think it's been widely distributed among directors. For those of you that manage compliance or legal issues related to this, should read it and understand what your board of directors is reading. Chelsea and Jim, I have lost internet connection to the slide presentation, so I'm going to have to ask you all to please move the slides since I can no longer see them. I hope I'm the only one that has lost this connection.
No, I've lost it too, but apparently Chelsea has it because she's moved us ahead.
Okay. All right, so I hope I answered the question. I think what a lot of boards are also looking for is to be sure that senior management has what you would call an incident response plan in place that has been well thought out, that has actually gone through tabletop exercises, has been run through several times addressing different kinds of potential breaches of information, so that should there be a breach, a loss of confidential information, that the company has a set of procedures in which to respond to it, key communications that would go out internally into the company as well as to key stakeholders externally. But we are going to move on to securing and protecting confidential assets, really thinking holistically. We've talked about embedding business process across your company. We talk about people, processes, and technology, that really looking at this 360 degrees. This is not just about information technology, cybersecurity. This is really looking holistically across your business and organization and understanding how to impact people, process, and technology. So first and foremost, we think it's important that you have policies that are well disseminated across your employees and key third parties so they understand what your policies are and the specific procedures in which to implement those policies, that you keep records about your interactions with employees on these issues, and you have very clear guidance to employees so they understand what they're supposed to do. Often this is in a contractual arrangement as new people come into your company or new third parties begin working with your company, as well as when employees leave the company. There could be some sort of contractual arrangement. We've talked about having a cross-functional team. We think this is critical, both to be preventative as well as to respond to incidents should they arise. And all of this requires a risk assessment. There was a question about, well, there's constantly new information coming into a company in terms of, companies are very dynamic and innovative. There's lots of collaborations going on, so confidential information continues to evolve every day. But really understanding where that information may be developed inside of the company, what is of most interest to others outside of the company. All of these things I think are critical in being able to focus on that information that is most critical to your company and where the greatest risks are. Management of third parties, we've talked a lot about understanding your key third parties, your suppliers, distributors, manufacturers, joint venture partners, law firms, consulting firms, anyone that has access to your key information. And what policies and procedures do they have in place? What information protection team do they have in place? How do they interact with their key third parties? How do they train their employees? All of these issues are critically important. Why don't I stop there, Jim, and see if you want to add anything to the first four boxes.
Yeah, I mean, just on that last one, knowing your partner is a critical area that people have not paid so much attention to until they heard about the Target breach and the fact that that breach happened not because necessarily Target's systems were so bad. They were pretty good. And perhaps part of it was because somebody wasn't watching the right lights blinking. But the way that the breach occurred was it came through their HVAC contractor, the air conditioning contractor that worked with them, that had a protection system that was substandard relative to targets, allowing the bad guys to get in there. And because the partner, this contractor, was a fully trusted, had a fully trusted relationship with target and was able to connect directly into its system, this provided a pathway for the hackers to get there. And this illustrates and underscores the importance of making sure, particularly when you're engaged in collaborations with companies and other parts of the world where intellectual property laws may not be as strong as they are here, to make sure that at both a contractual level and at an operational level, you make sure that they are doing the same kinds of things that you're doing, that their attitude about information protection is pretty much the same as yours is, so that your system, because it is distributed across all of these partner systems, is as robust as it can be.
Great. And just moving across the bottom of the slide, security and confidentiality. This is the physical security of your information as well as the network security. We've talked a lot about that it's not enough just to protect the perimeter of your network, but really understanding where this confidential information lies within your company in terms of who has access to it, where is it, and ensuring that the protections are quite specific to the information. Training and capacity building. We think this is an issue that employees should be trained on as they onboard into your company. Continuing training as they, perhaps on an annual basis, but certainly as individuals change roles and as they may come into contact more with your confidential information. And there may be different types of training for individuals who come into contact with financial and PII versus trade secrets. But ensuring that you have an ongoing training program. And I think, Jim mentioned some of the reasonable efforts that courts have raised as critical for protecting and securing trade secrets. And this issue of really engaging your employees and your employees aware of what you as a company believe are your trade secrets is critical.
Yeah,
and
indeed. If I can jump in there, Pamela, the effort and the resources that you put into training will pay off better than practically anything else that you can do, because, again, remembering that the greatest source of information loss is your workforce, more that you can do to raise their level of awareness and to have them keenly focused on their role as the frontline protectors of your most important assets, the better off you'll be. The training needs to be repeated. It can't just be, as Pamela has said, this onboarding, watch a video, and then forget it. It needs to come back again and again. It should be varied so that people get the messages in different kinds of ways. Management should be directly involved in this to reinforce the importance of the issue and to tell the company stories about how they have either had problems or successes in this area, which will help reinforce. And then individual reinforcements of the issue, reminders that come up to employees, pop-ups on their screen, and short videos that are sent around from time to time that keep people aware that this is something where they can have a very important impact, and it'll mean that all of the workforce is engaged and will be looking out for potential problems, strange behaviors, and call them to the attention of management. And when you can have a training program that produces that sort of behaviors, then you have, you've got the gold medal when it comes to patient protection.
Thank you, Jim. And just moving to the last two boxes, monitoring and measurement, do you have the ability to know when your policies have failed? Do you have a sort of a red flag system, whether that's with employees who are about to leave the company under strained situations? Do you have a way to understand that you should be engaging with those individuals or at least monitoring their network practices? How do you know when your systems are not working? Critically important in this context because, often these go undetected for a period of time, and the longer they're undetected, the greater damage that can be done. And finally, do you have corrective actions? When you do have a breach, what is it that you do to ensure that that breach does not happen again, and that you learn from that breach and can anticipate other kinds of breaches, and you work to protect against that? We have another question. Do you need a crisis program so people know how to act and who is involved? I think that's a great question. In fact, I was speaking to an associate general counsel and head of privacy for a major publishing house yesterday, and she was saying how the Sony incident was such a wake-up call for her company, but yet it's been very, very challenging to actually get the different people and roles in the company aligned, as well as the resources needed to implement a proactive preventative program. So you all know the cultures of your companies best. Sometimes a company does need a crisis to be able to align all of the people and resources to work in a more proactive preventative way. But I would suggest even doing a tabletop exercise where you can anticipate what it would be, sort of the ultimate loss for your company, and to do a tabletop exercise around that, bringing in your outside counsel, bringing in some key other consultants to work with you. In some cases, you can also engage your local regional FBI office in this exercise as well. So all of these are ways to help educate a broader group of leaders in your company and the need to be more proactive and preventative.
Now, we've had a related question, too, on how do you handle this issue of a different attitude by some people in the company. Perhaps they've come from an academic environment, and it's hard for them to sort of wrap their brains around the whole idea of protecting information. And this is a really good question, because these days a lot of companies bring people in from the outside, from different environments, where they may not have the right focus and the right attitude on information security, and they need to be brought along. I mean, I remember counseling with the biotech companies that started in the early 80s, and they were populated mainly by academics who came in and said, "What, you mean we can't publish our findings as soon as they're there? What's going on here?" And the answer has to be, this is a different environment, and the reason that you're getting paid more than you might get paid in another place is because the value of that information that you're creating can be realized only if we can protect it and bring it along in an appropriate way. And ultimately, it will get to the market. Ultimately, it will have an impact. Ultimately, you will have the professional satisfaction of knowing that your work has gotten to the public. But we need to care for it along the way. This is just attitude adjustment, education. It can be done, but it needs careful attention when you have people that come from a completely different kind of environment.
Thank you, Jim. We're going to move on to just sharing with you some practical advice and resources that we have available to help you. First, Jim is going to just sort of summarize, and a lot of this is in his book, on the principles of a protection plan.
Yeah, and here, this is pretty straightforward. The driver for all of this is, of course, need to know, which is balanced. You don't lock everything up, but you need to be thinking about how you distribute information and how you handle your information flows within the company to make sure that it gets to where it's supposed to go, but no farther. And then the principle of simplicity is really critical. So many companies have set up information protection programs that appear to have been based on military plans. They have 8 or 9 different categories of secrecy that people have to apply, and as a result, they're so complicated, no one complies with them, and that, of course, puts you in a worse situation in some ways than if you had no program at all. And then third, focusing on the secrets that matter. It's important to keep in mind that almost all secrets will get compromised at some point. Many of them already have, beyond your awareness, been compromised. And so part of your thinking that goes into these processes has to be, how do we prioritize our secrets? How do we analyze them so that we can have a sense of when they will organically and inevitably leak out, so that we can focus on the ones that are most important and not spend resources on protecting something that is likely to go out the door tomorrow. Finally, as we've said several times here, work on reducing the insider risks. If you can make progress there, you will have benefited the entire program in ways sometimes that are difficult to measure, but you can rest assured will be highly impactful. And then finally, think about this always as just another part of risk management. You're dealing with an asset that is vulnerable, that's highly valuable to the company. How do you identify the risks with respect to the different categories of asset? How do you mitigate those risks? And how do you look at this over time? That process is well known to all of us, and you can apply it to information management as well.
Great, thank you, Jim. And I just want to remind folks that we just have a few more slides, but we'll have time for more questions. In fact, there's a great question that just was listed. Sometimes the protection of information becomes so onerous that when needed, the real user himself is not able to access the information.
Right. And that's why I made that point at the top of this slide here. It's about need to know. So when you plan your information protection program, make sure you don't screw tight the doors that people need to open when they're making things happen in the company. They have to have access to data. It can be designed in a way so that you have various levels of controls and access. We're all familiar with that. It needs to be done with just as much attention to accessibility as to the need for controlling loss. So very good point that we all should keep in mind.
Great. Thank you, Jim. And we just wanted to share that based on this work with Create Leading Practices for IP Protection, we've had the opportunity to work with many companies on issues of key concern to them. And in particular, they're concerned about protecting trade secrets and confidential information. So in September of this year, we released our third service, Create Leading Practices for Trade Secret Protection. It looks at those 8 boxes that we talked about that are key to developing a comprehensive management system to protect and secure your trade secrets. We have a self-assessment that involves a series of questions that go against those 8 boxes, those 8 process categories. And by answering these questions, what we become to understand is your perception of your level of maturity in each of those areas. We then do an independent evaluation, and we can do this in a number of different languages, where we ask a different set of questions that go to the same 8 process categories, again, determining the level of your maturity in each of those areas. We then provide you benchmarking against the self-assessment and the independent evaluation, as well as benchmarking against other companies that have participated in Create Leading Practices. We then provide you with a summary report that identifies certain observations and also recommendations, where to prioritize for your organization. We have companies that want to do this internally and across their subsidiaries, and others that ask their key third parties to undergo an assessment and independent evaluation. What's key is that companies are aware of what is going on inside of their company, their maturity, their ability to actually address these issues, to ensure that they have the internal controls in place and they identify any gaps. So really spending time on maturing a company's internal business processes. Finally, there are a number of resources on our website relating to trade secret protection and intellectual property protection more broadly. These materials are available there for downloading, so please benefit from them. And then I really want to highly recommend Jim's book, which is available directly from the publisher and also on Amazon. And I'll let Jim summarize that for you, and then we'll close.
Yeah, just real quickly, this is a business book. There is no legal jargon, almost no footnotes, but filled with stories, lists, and forms that I hope will be
great.
So we are.
Thank you, Jim. We have time for just a few more questions, one or two questions. If there are any other questions, you all have had really terrific questions. I think they certainly signal that you all are thinking about these issues, are trying to tackle them. A few years ago, this was not an issue that compliance leaders were that focused on, and so yet it's another issue that you all are addressing directly or with your enterprise risk management colleagues.
I've seen in the question list a comment about the difficulty of dealing with passwords as part of information security, and I'm sure we can all relate to that, and I suppose help is on the way because we expect over time passwords will become passe and we'll all be using biometric ways to protect our access to information, and there will be two-factor authentication, and won't have to keep that list of passwords with us all the time.
But in the meantime,
it's an important part of information security hygiene, and we have to make sure that everybody does it, even though it's annoying.
Great. Well, thank you, Jim, very much for joining us today. It was terrific to do this with you. And thank you to Ethisphere for hosting us. We'll make our slide deck available to all of those of you that participated today, and we're also available should you have any questions. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pamela and Jen. On behalf of Ethisphere, I'd like to thank all of the attendees that did join us for today's webcast. As a reminder, Pamela did mention that we will have the slides presented for you in a follow-up email along with a recording of today's session. As I mentioned in the beginning, I will be more than happy to create a certificate of completion. I've already gotten a few requests, and if anyone does have any more, go ahead and put that in the chat box or simply reply to the follow-up email that will be sent over to you shortly by the end of the day today. I also did want to bring attention to our BELA community, which is our Business Ethics Leadership Alliance. Those members are offered complimentary registration to Ethisphere's Global Ethics Summit, which will be coming up this March, as well as other summits around the world. If you'd like to gain more information on BELA and how the community can be of service to you, please connect with my colleague Cindy Laney for more details there. As I mentioned, we do have global summits, and this year we're excited to be in Singapore for our Asia Ethics Summit, which is our third annual event there. If you have colleagues or any clients located in Asia, and we encourage you to share these details with them. I do have a few opportunities for some specials in regards to registration offers, so please send me an email or respond back to your follow-up with your recording and presentation materials, and I'm happy to address that. All other upcoming webcasts and roundtables as well as summits are listed on our events page at ethisphere.com/events. So we encourage you to see what new webcasts are of interest to you. Once again, if you have any other questions about future events or around this event in particular, please don't hesitate to let us know. Thank you for joining us again, and have a fantastic day.